May 4th, 1893. A Tuesday morning in Chicago, the doors of the Chemical National Bank swing open, but the tellers aren't smiling. By noon, the line of depositors stretches 3 city blocks. A sea of woe coats and trembling hands. People aren't just asking for their money. They are begging for it. Within 72 hours, the panic leaps like a brush fire to New York, then to the frontier towns of the West. 500 banks, the very pillars of American stability, are about to vanish into thin air. By the end of the summer, the sound of the air isn't the whistle of progress. It is the sound of thousands of vault doors slamming shut on the emptied promises of a century. This is the moment the American dream ran out of cash. To understand why 500 banks broke in just 100 days, we have to look back at the decades that built the trap. Between 1870 and 1890, America was obsessed with a single word: expansion. We were building railroads to nowhere, fueled by railroad bonds. Think of these bonds as massive, high-interest IOUs that promised investors a piece of the future. The problem? The future was being built on credit, not gold. The banking system of the 19th century was a wild, unregulated frontier. Most banks were unit banks, meaning they stood alone. If a bank in Kansas lost its money, there was no central reserve to save it. These banks were all connected by a fragile web of merchant banking and gold-backed currency. To keep the economy moving, banks used a system called fractional reserves. For every $10 you deposited, the bank might only keep $1 in the vault, lending the other 9 out to railroad tycoons and land speculators. It worked perfectly as long as everyone believed the railroads would make money. But in early 1893, the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad declared bankruptcy. It was like pulling the bottom card out of a skyscraper. Suddenly, the railroad bonds held by banks across the country weren't worth the paper they were printed on. When one bank failed, the news traveled by telegraph at the speed of light. People in the next town didn't wait to see if their bank was safe. They ran. This is what we call a bank run. It is a psychological contagion. If you think your neighbor is going to take his money out, you have to get yours out first. But remember the fractional reserves. The banks didn't have the money. They had bills of exchange, promises of payment from other businesses, and those businesses were also broke. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you are watching this from. It genuinely surprises us every time how far these stories travel. As the summer of 1893 heated up, the crisis took a political turn. There was a fierce battle over the gold standard versus free silver. The government had been buying massive amounts of silver to prop up mining interests, but European investors were terrified this would devalue the dollar. They began pulling their gold out of American banks and shipping it back to London and Paris. This created a liquidity crunch. The banks were being squeezed from both sides. Ordinary citizens were draining the vaults from the front door, and international investors were draining them from the back. By July, the ghost banks began to appear. These were institutions that looked perfectly fine on the outside: marble columns, gold-lettered signs, but on the inside, they were hollow. In Denver, 10 banks failed in 3 days. In the South, crop liens, loans made to farmers based on the value of their future harvests, became worthless as crop prices plummeted. The men who built these banks weren't all villains. Many were local leaders who truly believed the boom would last forever. But they had built a system that lacked a lender of last resort. There was no safety net. When the trust evaporated, the money evaporated with it. By the time the 100th day arrived, over 15,000 businesses had failed along with those 500 banks. Unemployment hit 20%. Families who had spent 20 years building a farm lost it in 20 minutes because a banker in a city they had never visited made a bad bet on a railroad in a state they had never seen. The panic of 1893 was a brutal lesson in the fragility of a world built on debt and optimism. It revealed a fundamental flaw in human nature, our tendency to mistake a temporary boom for a permanent reality. We want to believe that the graph only goes up, and we are willing to build massive, complex systems based on that single, shaky hope. The architects of the 19th century banking system created a machine of incredible power. It funded the industrialization of a continent and turned a collection of colonies into a global titan. But they built it without brakes. They exploited the public's trust to fuel expansion. And when that expansion hit a wall, they were powerless to stop the carnage. Ordinary people were crushed not because they were greedy, but because they were part of a system that required their total, unthinking faith to function. When that faith was broken, the ghost banks were all that remained, monuments to a time when we forgot that money is only as real as the trust behind it. The ending of 1893 didn't just lead to a recession, it led to a complete rethinking of how we handle money. It eventually paved the way for the creation of the Federal Reserve and the banking laws we live under today. But it came at a staggering cost. It left a generation of Americans unsettled, quietly amazed that the solid brick-and-mortar institutions of their towns could disappear as quickly as a morning mist. History doesn't just repeat, it rhymes. The forces that broke those 500 banks are still at work today, hidden beneath more complex layers of technology and jargon. But at the end of the day, it still comes down to the same thing: the ledger books, the vaults, and the question of who we trust with our future. If you want to keep following the trail of how money and power shaped our world, make sure to like this video and subscribe. We're going to keep digging through the rubble of the 1800s to find the truths that were left behind. Thanks for watching.